glad myself and Frank are in a position this afternoon to give you a break from economics. I know economics is now the sexy subject. An economist friend of mine said recently that one time when he used to go to dinner parties, they'd sit down at the table, he'd turn around, introduce himself, ask what you do, and say, "Oh, I'm an economist," and you could just see that the other guests had realised that they had drawn the short straw. Now at parties, when people hear there's an economist in the room, they knock each other over to end up sitting beside him. Us political pundits, however, must soldier on and try to make some of the data, dimensions, implications of politics interesting and accessible, we hope. We're often asked as political analysts, as part of the kind of horse racing coverage of politics, to predict outcomes. At the height of election campaigns, people like Sean O'Rourke and others love to pressurise us and say, well, right, that's all well and good, that's fine, what's going to happen? And I suppose in reality we're not psychics, we're not time travellers. We can do no more than assess previous voter behaviour, recent polling trends, select the good polling information, and then try to identify the campaign and non-campaign items which might influence the result, and take a guess about what might happen in the forthcoming election. Guessing the outcome of the 2002 local and European elections was a lot easier for a couple of reasons. All the polling data for 6 months before the election showed the main government party, Fianna Fáil, suffering a hammering in its support rating in the polls, and therefore it was obvious it was going to lose again a large number of local authority seats. Once significant polls emerged about the various Euro constituencies, it was clear to see, if not the outcomes, then at least who was going to be in the frame for the final seats. It was going to be Joe Higgins or Owen Ryan battle, Cathy Sinnott, Alan Kelly. Didn't spot Theresa first, but a Cathy Sinnott, Alan Kelly type battle in Munster or things like that. Once George Lee was selected for Fine Gael in Dublin South, that one was easy to predict. Dublin Central proved an awful lot more complicated, in part because all of us analysts feed in large part on information from the large political parties, and we often miss the impact of independence, and the shifts that happened in the last week or two for independence, and Maureen O'Sullivan is a classic example of that. I'm always more comfortable in a position where I'm asked to look back and assess the recent past than in a situation where I'm being compelled to predict even the near future. That's why I'm always grateful for what has now become a standing invitation from Joe Mulholland to come to McGill some weeks after local and European or general elections to give an assessment of what its implications were or what did or didn't happen. People used to call myself and Ivan Yates during the last general election as Zig and Zag. Somebody last night called this billing as Morecambe and Wise, who apparently were British comedians some years ago. Myself and Frank have done this on a couple of occasions. I'm particularly conscious on this occasion that, as well as sharing the platform with Frank Fanry, the pundit, I'm sharing the platform with Frank Fanry, the player, and indeed Frank Fanry, the factor in the last election campaign. My professional respect for him means I'm not going to raise the issue of whether what he said did or didn't have an impact on the election. But in the best tradition of McGill, I think the audience should feel free to ask him the question afterwards, if you so wish. Joe Mulholland, however, couldn't resist the temptation to ask us to speculate. He put a question mark at the end of the question, has the political landscape changed? And inevitably, therefore, he draws us to try to draw, or forces us, or tempts us, shall I say, to try to draw some implications from the results of the recent elections. It was the last month's elections, a historical change in the Irish political landscape. In my view, the results of these three sets of elections held last month did not represent the historic transformation in Irish politics which some have found it to be, or which some hope it was. The results of the elections did, however, alter the political landscape to this extent. A large block of support has left Fianna Fáil and has moved primarily to Fine Gael and to a lesser extent to Labour in Dublin. If you take the landscape analogy, a hill has moved. A hill of support has moved from Fianna Fáil to Fine Gael. That shift in support has left Fine Gael, this is the historic element of it, that shift in support has left Fine Gael by far the largest party in local government. Whether or not this shift will endure as a lasting change in the political landscape, even in the medium term, remains to be seen. My guess, however, is that it will. And we have to be careful here. Myself and Frank gathered here in July of 2004 after those local European elections, and looking at those elections, one would have said that Fianna Fáil's capacity to secure re-election in the general election 2007 was perhaps fatally undermined by the results of the local and European elections in 2004. Fianna Fáil, again, proved many of the pundits wrong, and in the last week in particular, managed to turn the general election 2007 around. Because, as I said, and Joe thankfully reminded the audience last night, because it was the economy. Because a massive middle class vote in particular, was too nervous about the economy to hand it over to Fine Gael. At that stage, they didn't realise the extent to which the economic crisis that was going to hit, and it wasn't clear the extent to which they were going to hold Fianna Fáil accountable for it. The reason I believe things are different this time, and that I say the shift in political landscape will endure at least until the next general election, is because the scale of the shift in support away from Fianna Fáil is larger, much larger, and it comes after a shift of support in the last local European elections. The economic uncertainty in which this shift occurred will persist at least until the next general election. And I think also that the results of the 2000 elections show an underlying weakness in Fianna Fáil's organisation and electoral capacity, which I want to talk a bit about in a moment, but if you explore deeply, it shows some serious gaps in what was assumed by many of us to be an invincible political machine. Put simply, Fianna Fáil's position is vulnerable, and particularly vulnerable in Dublin. I had originally, like everybody I think, thought of using slides and some tables of the results. Frank, in fairness, has gone through a lot of the bullet points of the results. And having watched Brian Lenihan's Al Gore Inconvenient Economic Truth presentation last night, I'm completely sure of the wisdom necessarily of doing these things by PowerPoint, and watching Brendan Toohey here yesterday afternoon try to deal with when both the sound and lights went off, I decided against it. So I'm not going to bog you down in figures, except to say that there are 883 seats in the county and city councils. If we look at the local election results first, Fine Gael now has 120 or 123, I think, more seats on city and county councils than Fianna Fáil has. That is the historic shift in this election within local government. Fine Gael got 128,000 more votes in the local elections than Fianna Fáil did. That is a significant and historic figure. The gap between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael was 105 a decade ago after the 1999 elections, but it was in Fianna Fáil's favour. It narrowed to 8 seats between them after the 2004 election. It's now widened again, but this time in Fine Gael's favour, to the bigger element of 128. For example, there are 22 Fianna Fáil members of Cork County Council. Fine Gael members of Cork County Council. There are only 12 Fianna Fáil members of Cork County Council. That's a dramatic transformation in the make-up and shape of local government in this country. It is only, however, when you put the local elections, the last two local elections beside each other, that you begin to realise the scale of the drop in Fianna Fáil support. Fianna Fáil lost just under 90 seats in the city and council elections in this general election. But that was on top of the loss of 82 county and city council seats in 2004. Fianna Fáil has lost 169 council seats in the last decade, city and county council seats. It's reduced its local authority representation, at least at that, the most significant level, by 40-45%. Its vote share has fallen in the local elections by 13.5% in the last decade. That's a significant setback in local government. Turning briefly to the European elections, and again, headline figure, Fine Gael got 92,000 more votes in the European elections than Fianna Fáil did. The make-up of our representation in the European Parliament has been transformed over the last 3 elections. We had 15 MEPs in 1999, 6 of them were Fianna Fáil, 4 were Fine Gael, 2 Greens, remember Nuala Ahern and Patricia McKenna, then a Green. Francesca Rossa was there, and there were 2 independents, Dana Rosemary Scallon and Pat Cox. We had 13 MEPs after the last European elections. Fine Gael had this historic breakthrough, if you like, of becoming the largest party in the Irish party in the European Parliament with 5 of the seats. Fianna Fáil had just 4, Labour still had 1, Sinn Féin got Mary Lou as their first seat in the Republic, and there were 2 independents. But now look at the shape of it. There are 12 Fianna Fáil MEPs going every Monday morning to Brussels. 4 of them are Fine Gaelers. It's a fall by 1 seat. But Labour has as many MEPs going to Brussels as Fianna Fáil. They both have 3. The Socialist Party, of course, have Joe Higgins and Marion Harkin is there. It's interesting too to watch. If you look at the Fianna Fáil vote share, again across the last decade, they're down 6.5 percentage points in Dublin in that 10 years. Their vote is down 10 percentage points in East or Leinster constituency, whatever you call it. Their vote has halved in the Munster or South constituency over the last 10 years. And in the North and West, this part of the country, Fianna Fáil's vote is down 10% in European elections, 10 percentage points in the European elections. So the fall in the European elections is significant. What I think hasn't got enough attention, because it's actually the most useful indicator in some ways of the national implications of Fianna Fáil's support level at the moment, is the 2 by-elections. In the Dublin Central by-election, Adrian Kavanagh, who's a political geographer, in my view, one of the most interesting people playing with maps and political data in Ireland, did an analysis of the by-elections from 1980 until 2006. And he showed that on average Fianna Fáil lost about 8% of the vote in the by-election as against the previous general election. So, we've known that since Noel Tracy, Fianna Fáil hasn't won a by-election. In government, Fianna Fáil doesn't win elections in government. And in government, they go down 8 or 9 or 10% in their vote by comparison to the last general election. Of course, what you have to be doing to win a by-election is go up, and go up dramatically. However, in the Dublin Central by-election, Fianna Fáil's vote collapsed almost 4 times that Adrian Kavanagh average. Nearly more than 12,000 people voted for a Fianna Fáil candidate called Ahern in Dublin Central in the general election in 2007. Only 3,400 voted for a Fianna Fáil candidate called Ahern in the same constituency in the by-election held last month. That is a dramatic, even allowing for the peculiarities of the Bertie Ahern operation in his own home turf, that's a dramatic collapse in Fianna Fáil's vote, which would scare the hell out of Fianna Fáil TDs in Dublin and really terrify those Fianna Fáil TDs on the north side of the capital. The Dublin South by-election is a more dramatic story. The Fine Gael vote with George Lee on the banner doubled nearly. It's a dramatic doubling of its support, 53%, 0.4% on the first count. The type of vote share that has not been achieved by a candidate in a by-election since Brian Cowan himself did it, what is it now, 20, 25 years, suggests George Lee has a very bright political future in front of him. It suggests he'll be Taoiseach someday, if only for a couple of years. The other significant point, before moving on from the statistics, is that the reason these local European elections and by-elections are important, local European elections in particular are important, is because, unlike previously, the turnout was very high. The turnout in 2004 in the local elections was very high. It was only 2 or 3 points less than a general election. The turnout in these local elections was the same. It's only 2 or 3 percentage points less than a general election. So almost as many people went out and voted in the last 2 local elections as did generally in our general elections. And that's unusual. Usually, 10% of the population who go and vote in general elections stay at home for local elections. It means that people went out, and in my view went out because they were annoyed. Voter annoyance is the biggest mobilising factor in second-order election turnout, in local European election turnout. And if people were annoyed in 2004, and you remember they were about the suggestion that there were spending cuts promised that weren't revealed before the 2002 election. There was a leak of a memo to the Sunday Tribune. It was revealed all these cuts were happening. For about 18 months, 24 months afterwards, public anger was there at the way the government had, in a sense, some felt got a false mandate from the public, and people went out in large numbers and punished them, the government in the local European elections. Well, if they were mad in 2004, to borrow a phrase, they were mad as hell last month in the 2009 elections. The turnout is important. It shows that a large chunk of the electorate got to make their say. Now, the reasons for the fall in the Fianna Fáil support, as you'll find, I don't disagree much with Frank on this. I said here in 2004 that anger was the reason for the anger at the then Bertie Ahern government was the reason for the collapse in the Fianna Fáil support then, which was it's their worst vote in history. They did an awful lot worse again in this election. And I think that, and I said this once I looked at the opinion polls last November and again in March from TNSM or BI, that the electorate have come to a view as to who's responsible for the economic crisis in Ireland. They might be right, they might be wrong. You can hold a series of McGill summer schools or historical seminars in the future arguing where, what and how happened Ireland's economic crisis, but for political analysts, perception matters more than anything else. Rightly or wrongly, the electorate have decided that the government are responsible for the economic crisis, and the poll results, the election results, are about political accountability. The electorate are holding Fianna Fáil to account for the disastrous economic situation, and they're saying 80 of your councillors will have lost their seats as a result. Your MEP loses his seat in Dublin as a result. To that extent, the electorate, or the system is working, the electorate are holding Fianna Fáil to it. It is not because the public don't understand the scale of the economic situation. It's precisely that they do understand the scale of the economic situation and that they are holding the sitting government, and Fianna Fáil in particular, to account. It's not either that they're angry at the government for the steps it's now taking to correct the situation. It's that they're blaming the government for getting us into it. They're not the survivors taking issue with the captain for the direction in which he's taking the lifeboat. It's anger of those on the lifeboat about the fact that they're no longer on the cruise liner, and they don't accept that there was any icebergs at fault, that it was entirely the captain's fault, and that's why they're visiting their responsibility. That ain't going to change much, because as the government settles down, as we've discussed here at length yesterday, to make even more difficult and unpalatable political and economic decisions in the months to come, there is no reason to believe that Fianna Fáil's support is going to improve, if they manage to stabilise it. That of itself will be a lot. The government may, it's a big may, manage to turn the economic situation around, at least stabilise it in the next 24 to 36 months, assuming they get through the autumn. That's the time frame for the next general election. They may manage to turn the economic situation around, but they will find it very difficult to turn the political situation around. In the word of one senior Fianna Fáil politician to me, he says, "Noel," he said, "they may leave us there to sort out the problem, but they'll never forgive us for getting them into it." And I think that's the substantial political problem. I know the bell will probably ring in a second, but there are two or three observations I want to make about the state of what these results reveal about the state internally of the Fianna Fáil organisation. Maybe in questions we can discuss the Labour Party and the Greens. The first thing I think it reveals is that when I worked in Fianna Fáil headquarters in the 1990s, the biggest organisational concern was the inability of the party to develop strong organisations in urban areas and in Dublin in particular. As Ireland was urbanising, and as you had this massive commuter belt, this political party structure, which Lemass in particular had designed, based on a parish-by-parish network around the country, which had been extraordinarily effective, as Frank says, perhaps the most effective, one of the most effective political organisations in Western democracy, suddenly it wasn't able to cut and sustain that level of organisation in urban and Dublin. Everything was tried. Seamus Brennan was given a job of setting up ward systems around Dublin. There was trying to amalgamate commons and do it on a street basis, do it on street by street to mirror what Bertie Ahern had done in Dublin Central. And by 1991, in that disastrous election for Fianna Fáil that Albert Reynolds led it, the extent of that urban problem, and Dublin problem in particular for Fianna Fáil, was revealed. It was then masked and absorbed successfully by the magic that was the Bertie Ahern brand. Here you had this young, fresh, campaigning, vigorous, Dublin-based, urban leader who managed to graft this strong support base and this Ahern brand on top of the traditional Fianna Fáil brand and deliver what, frankly, and Bertie Ahern's reputation will go under a lot of reassessment in the years to come for his policy performance, but in terms of political performance, that was quite extraordinary. The other thing that happened, and I could nearly go through constituency by constituency and give you examples, is that instead of building an organisation or rebuilding an organisation, what the party did when gaps arose, when it needed to find new people to win seats and when it needed to try to win extra seats, was it identified a young person, or man or woman, or another personality either within the party or outside and said, right, you build your own organisation, you build your own team, You pay for your own literature. You pay guys to put posters up. You build this separate parallel operation, put the Fianna Fáil brand on it, and go off and, combine this new suburban commuter belt electorate and get seats. And that well and good, and that delivered, and that had an impact, particularly again, I think, in 2007. But it meant that when local and European elections came around and the sitting TD or the Dáil contender had no vested interest in the outcome, there was no standing party organisation to knock doors asking people to vote for a ticket of candidates. It also meant, and let's whisper this, that there's a financial crisis coming in Irish politics, which is yet not spoken about. If you look at the funding of Irish politics, particularly Fianna Fáil, and to an extent in Fine Gael, individual candidates have to come up with a lot of money themselves to sustain this professionalised campaigning. And the sources it came from, if you look at the brochures for golf classics, fundraising nights for political parties, you'll find ads from small businesses and local businesses, yes, will have little money in the next 18 months to 36 months. Also from the property sector, if you look at any of those brochures, the fundraising lines, declared and undeclared by the political parties, you'll see that 40–45% of their funding came in one shape or form from the property boom. That funding ain't going to be available either in the medium term for political parties. The other dramatic and significant mistake I think Fianna Fáil made in these local elections was that they decided in the most local electoral areas to have a national committee select their local election candidates. It was a crazy idea because it gave the local organisations the excuse to sit out the election campaign when it came proper, which at a time when you were trying to hold core vote was crazy. Fianna Fáil have been very successful under Ray McSherry committee firstly, and then a committee chaired by Brian Cowan, in targeting, building its candidate slates for Dáil elections. But it was done by a campaign committee of the likes of PJ Maher and senior officials, senior government politicians, who polled constituencies repeatedly, or assessed opinion in constituencies repeatedly, tested potential candidates repeatedly, and then called the convention or massaged the convention or timed the convention to deliver the outcome, and if the convention couldn't deliver the outcome, added a candidate after it. I'm going to make one last point. If you look back at it, I did a deal a couple of weeks ago with Gillian Macmillan to write a history of Fianna Fáil. It's the first time a book, or kind of a biography of Fianna Fáil as a history has been written, and sometime over the next year or two I hope to complete it. It means I've been looking at some of the historical context of recent elections. When the publisher of Gillian Macmillan came to me and I said, well, what are you looking for? And he said, well, a biography of Fianna Fáil. And I said, well, is it an obituary you're looking for? And because the obituary is not time to write the obituary, but one thing does strike me, that if you look at the reorganisations and renewals of Fianna Fáil that happened, the Mash in the late 70s and again in the mid 50s, Jack Lynch in 73 to 77, and Bertie Ahern's best organisation years were 96 and the first half of 97. They all happened when Fianna Fáil was in opposition. Fianna Fáil is going to have to find a way to renew and revitalise its organisation while it is simultaneously in government, or it's about to get her another sustained period in opposition to renew itself.